Welcome to the Idaho Way. I am Scott McIntosh, opinion editor for the Idaho Statesman.
And I'm Bryan Clark, opinion writer.
This week we are talking about the firing squad and the death penalty in Idaho.
We're talking about House Bill 186, which was sponsored by Representative Bruce Skog and Senator Doug Ricks. That bill passed the House 50-15 and the Senate 24-11, and Little signed it into law on May 24th.
And just a reminder to our viewers that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below in YouTube or in Facebook. And we'll do our best to answer them during the show. We already have a couple of questions that we're going to get to. But joining us this week to talk about the issue is Idaho Statesman reporter and resident expert on the subject, Kevin Fixler. Kevin, thanks for joining us this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. Well, first off, let's talk about the firing squad bill. We're going to talk about the death penalty in general, and hopefully we'll be able to cram it all in a half hour. But let's talk about the firing squad bill first. And I want to highlight a key point about the bill that I think maybe is a little bit misunderstood, that it doesn't just offer the firing squad as a backup option. It actually mandates that the state use the firing squad if the state cannot procure the drugs for lethal injection. So talk a little bit about what the bill actually says and what the bill actually does.
Sure. So the bill requires, as you pointed out, that the firing squad be used as the alternative method. And the way that Idaho's law is written is that the director of the prison system is granted 5 days to make that determination. So the preferred method remains lethal injection in our state. If those drugs cannot be procured within that period, in this case, Director Josh Tewalt will decide and inform officials who need to know that they will default to the firing squad as the execution method.
And maybe talk a little bit about the logistics. They've got it, because I know you wrote a lot about kind of the costs and what needs to happen. They can't just go down to Blacks Creek shooting range and set a guy up at the post and execute him. There's a little bit more that goes into it. So talk a little bit about what has to happen first.
Yeah, so there's two elements that really remain to be completed, and it should be noted that this bill was passed with an emergency clause. So after Governor Little signed it, it takes effect on July 1st. So first, they have to develop policies and procedures. As many people know, especially those interested in this issue, Idaho actually previously had the firing squad on the books from 1982 to 2009 before it was pulled. There were questions of its constitutionality, actually. So there's probably some prior policies in which they can revert and review, and those have to be passed by the board for the Idaho Department of Correction. So that process still has to take place. Those have to be adopted. And then also they have to build out a what will be a section or a retrofit on one of their cell blocks at the MC prison outside of Kuna, where Idaho death row inmates are housed.
Which is near Blacks Creek, interestingly enough.
Can you talk a little bit about the background of how we got here? For a long time, Idaho executed death row inmates with lethal injections, but recent decade or maybe two, it's been increasingly difficult to procure drugs. Why is that?
Yeah, so the history of Idaho's death penalty is that they always hung inmates, and then the two methods that they eventually adopted were both the firing squad and lethal injection. And again, that remained the preferred method. And after 2009, that was the only method on the books. By the way, firing squad has never been used in the state, despite the fact that it had been as part of the law for some period, and now will be restored. So we'll see if that happens. But I mean, the history is that there's been just 3 lethal injections in executions in modern Idaho history. The last 2 were in 2011 and 2012, and these drugs they've become very difficult to get. That's not just for Idaho, but across the United States. And part of that is pharmaceutical manufacturers and also pharmacies have basically been publicly shamed to some extent. and decided for ethical reasons, or again, based on not wanting the publicity of having provided these to prison systems, to no longer do that. Idaho has kind of a dubious history based on those two prior lethal injections, Paul Rhodes in 2011 and Leavitt was the last name of the inmate in 2012. And the state went to pretty extensive lengths in order to acquire those drugs from two different pharmacies that had kind of questionable safety histories. And so, there's a history there. And then, cash payments in parking lots in Washington, and also, private planes in order to, they're state planes actually, in order to get them. And they even leveraged the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, a pharmacist there, for the case in 2011 in order to acquire the drugs. So as a result, these drugs have become difficult to acquire. And so the state was seeking an alternative method because they don't believe that they're able to obtain them. And in fact, in a situation just in December, they opted not to move forward with an execution of death row inmate Gerald Pizzuto because they couldn't acquire the drugs.
And that's really kind of the main driving force behind the argument to have the firing squad is that, look, our only method available to us is lethal injection. And if we can't procure the drugs, then effectively we don't have a death penalty in Idaho. And so that's kind of the main argument for the firing squad, right?
It is. It's the bill sponsors mentioned this. The chief litigator for the Attorney General's office, his name is Lamont Anderson, with regards to capital cases. He's made the same argument that essentially we don't have a death penalty that can be, pardon the pun, but executed as a result of not being able to acquire the drugs. And so, that is kind of pulled off the books. I should also note, Scott, that it was also noted by bill sponsors that this might actually be a more humane way to execute inmates. Bruce Skog, a former deputy Ada County prosecutor, actually made that argument that he personally feels that the firing squad is more humane as a method, even though he did say that the state's preferred method remains lethal injection, then that would still be his preferred method as well.
Well, I wrote a column about it a couple months ago or a month or so ago, and that's kind of what the research shows is that there have been an increasing number of botched lethal injection executions that they didn't have the combination right or whatever, and there've been tremendous suffering from some of those who were executed. But with the firing squad, there are actually no botched firing squad executions on record, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. So that was interesting. But the firing squad may seem like a little less humane of a method. And one of our viewers, Charles, brings up a good question, talking about the constitutionality of cruel and unusual punishment. I think that's the 8th Amendment is cruel and unusual punishment. And he was asking if there's a court case that says punishment doesn't have to be painless, and have there been court cases that ruled that other methods like electric chair, gas chamber, lynching were cruel and unusual. So maybe talk a little bit about the constitutionality of the firing squad and the court questions about it.
Yeah, I can address that a little bit. These issues have been brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, and Bryan might know a little bit more about it than I even, but that is frequently the argument that a method like the firing squad may violate the 8th Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Idaho signing this into law, or at least when it takes effect, will make it the 5th state. So actually, I was on the phone today with a local defense attorney. And, by definition, it is sort of an unusual punishment. Firing squad has only been used 3 times in modern American history. All 3 were in Utah. The last was in 2010. So, from a legal standpoint, perhaps its infrequency might make that unusual. But the increasing number of states, including Tennessee, which is also looking at this law this year during the legislative session, it probably makes it less unusual if there is a firing squad execution, and also the more states that jump in. So getting at this question of whether or not this is cruel, in speaking with Bruce Skog, again, the bill sponsor in the House, who is still an attorney, he made the point that, from what I've heard and read, it's 10 seconds of extreme pain and then you're done. And that was a quote that he had given me during an interview. Lamont Anderson, I believe, testified before the House and or the Senate committees as part of the bill's passage that it's somewhere between 10 and 60 seconds of severe, extreme pain, whatever we want to say. The interesting thing about lethal injection, even though it is our country's preferred method in many cases, we really don't know what's going on inside someone's body. And there have been a number of botched executions. Bruce Skog actually pointed to that as being something that could be considered cruel, less humane. And but there have been people who have survived botched executions and described what's going on in their body, that basically there's a fire lit inside of them. And, it's sort of this medical practice or the appearance of that as far as, what that method represents. But I think we've learned more through history that if you use the wrong drug or an underdose, or, you don't get the cocktail correct, if it's a multi-drug process, as Idaho has, then it could probably be deemed cruel. And those are arguments made by even Idaho defense attorneys as part of their defense of their death row inmates.
Yeah, and with regard to the Supreme Court precedents on this, the main one from 1890 is, as I understand it, is Kemmler, where the court basically said that execution would be cruel cruel and unusual if it involved, quote, torture or a lingering death. The examples they gave were things like burning at the stake, burning on the wheel, historical methods of execution that were a little nearer in time during that ruling. But as it's applied to specific methods of execution, it's always been sort of all over the map. One piece of indication about where the current court may be came from a 2008 decision called Bays versus Reese. There was a concurrence that Clarence Thomas wrote, in which he basically said the way you ought to evaluate whether a method of execution is cruel and unusual is if it causes more pain than historically prevalent examples of execution, like hanging in the firing squad, were the examples that he gave. So at least in Thomas's mind, those are sort of the baseline. And if it's less than that, less painful than that, then it's fine. If it's more painful than that, maybe you have to look at it. There's a lot of justices on the court, but the current Supreme Court, I would bet, is not going to be very sympathetic to challenges to the firing squad.
Should note also that South Carolina was the most recent state before Idaho to pass this, and there is a legal battle that's taking place. A lower district court did rule, in fact, that their two methods, which I'd have to double check, but I believe the inmate gets the choice between the firing squad and the electric chair are their two methods. And I guess that's if lethal injection is, the drugs aren't available. A lower court ruled those unconstitutional. That then rose to the South Carolina Supreme Court. They actually remanded it back to that lower court to review whether or not the state had worked hard enough to try to locate drugs, rather than ruling on whether or not they believe this is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. So whether or not that's something that Idaho will face as far as legal challenges, unclear. But what I will tell you is that the Attorney General's office believes that this does not represent cruel and unusual punishment. That was testified by Lamont Anderson and Bruce Skog, again, the man who carried the bill in the House, testified that was the legal guidance he was given in carrying the bill.
So let's talk a little bit about, I guess you'd call it friction between perhaps the Attorney General's office, the Governor's office, and the Department of Correction. Tell us a little bit of the background about the Department of Correction's role in this, because I think the one thing too to not discount here is the fact that the Department of Correction would have to carry out these orders if it's a firing squad. So somebody would have to pull the trigger and that might be a difficult thing to do for some people. So talk a little bit about the Department of Corrections' role or lack of role in this whole debate.
So Governor Little has stated more than once, and including in a transmittal letter upon signing the bill, that he has continued concerns about the impact this would have on corrections officials. To your point, somebody would have to pull the trigger. During testimony and floor debate, there was discussion from lawmakers, including those who carried the bill, that perhaps this could be mechanized. So that's, an ongoing discussion, and that will be part of the policies and procedures that are probably developed and ultimately passed by the Idaho Department of Correction Board. So that's kind of that element. But, everybody talks about how there's an impact on anybody who's involved in this, including lawmaker Dan Foreman in the House, who really was adamantly against this. And he's a representative out of Moscow. So, and I'm sorry, okay. So the Department of Correction, I was told they were surprised by this bill. And the fact is, this is something that the department had considered adding back in as recently as 2014. They ultimately decided that the costs were too high and they were going to be investing too much time in order to develop it. At that time, they estimated costs at about $300,000, and that was reported by Betsy Russell, as she was a member of the spokesman review at the time. I did confirm that information by Jeff Ray, spokesman for IDOC, and so we know that to be the facts. But they were surprised by this bill, which AG Labrador confirmed to me directly that he helped to co-author and review. And also, again, Bruce Skog, who sits on the Judiciary Committee in the House, he had said even last year during debate about a different bill related to executions and shielding those who might sell execution drugs to the state, that this might be the route they have to go if they ultimately are not able to purchase lethal injection drugs. So again, it came as a bit of a surprise. The Department of Correction learned about the bill just days before, and then ultimately provided the cost estimate of about $750,000 they believe it would cost in order to build out the cell block to provide for the area where they would conduct this form of execution. The debate is sort of between the governor's office perhaps and the attorney general's office. Whose responsibility was it to consult sort of quote unquote the experts in the room, the people who have to carry out executions? It sort of relates also to Director T. Walt, again with the Department of Correction, not being aware that the Attorney General had sought a new death warrant for death row inmate Gerald Pizzuto. A press release was issued about the securing of that death warrant that was in February. And in fact, news went out to news outlets before the director actually had that in hand in order to serve it to the death row inmate. And from records I received in a public records request from the governor's office, I could see correspondence between T-Walt and the prisons liaison, an attorney who sits on the governor's staff, pointing out that he had not received that death warrant yet, and that created actually security concerns for prison officials, because if word gets out to inmates and then you're trying to move the death row inmate to the more secure area during that waiting period before someone is executed, it could create challenges for them to do so.
So I think another interesting aspect is that'll come up as it's considered whether or not this is a painless death. There've been some reports from when the firing squad was used historically of people living for or at least having brain activity for up to 2 minutes. NBC has some reporting going down this. So I think that'll be interesting as the court challenges come up. Are you aware of any challenges being filed yet or in the works?
So aside from what's happening in South Carolina, which they passed the bill in 2021, and we're still waiting on, I guess, the next step for that district court to respond to the South Carolina Supreme Court. And then depending on what they determine, that could then be appealed to, a higher federal level. Ultimately, perhaps the U.S. Supreme Court would weigh in at that point. Also, I've been informed that actually in Utah, in the last couple of weeks, a recent case was filed related to the constitutionality at the state level of the firing squad. So that's the extent of that I know, but I mean, clearly that would be one of the arguments posed, that this is a violation of Eighth Amendment rights. But again, it's going to come down to the various judges and state and federal levels to weigh in on that. And beyond that, I'm not sure how long somebody living beyond the physical pain, how much that weighs in. Because again, with lethal injection, I mean, these people are made sort of comatose to experience, the stoppage of their heart. And so we don't know, on average, especially depending on the type of medical personnel who are involved, how long those people are sort of quote unquote suffering or dealing with pain as they, fade away.
So, one of the interesting things to me about the whole firing squad issue and debate is that, there are a lot of people who, maybe are a little bit on the fence about the death penalty. They're, particularly when it's lethal injection, it's perceived as, so-called humane execution. But then introduction of the firing squad might push them over the edge and say, oh, geez, this really is not the most humane thing for the state to be doing. But set the stage a little bit about where we're at in terms of Idaho's death row. We've got the most recent one and that's been in the news is Gerald Pizzuto, and his execution has been lingering for a long time. So maybe talk a little bit about the Gerald Pizzuto case and then the other death row inmates that we've got in Idaho.
Yeah, sure thing. So there's 8 people currently on Idaho death row. They're all housed at the prison outside of Kuna, with the exception of one individual, a woman named Robin Rowe. She's Idaho's only female on death row, and she's actually at the women's prison in Pocatello. I'll come back to her in a moment. Gerald Pizzuto, 67 years old. He suffers from late stage bladder cancer. He's actually been on hospice care for more than 3 years, which that's probably hard for most people to believe. But essentially what that means is he doesn't receive any sort of life extending care. It's basically just a management of pain at this point. But the state has tried unsuccessfully 5 times to execute him by issuing death warrants since his 1986 conviction and sentencing in the murder of 2 individuals in a cabin north of McCall. He was convicted of bludgeoning those 2 people to death with a hammer. So pretty brutal situation. He was actually later convicted of 2 additional murders in Washington State, but obviously already had the death sentence here in Idaho, so remains here. So they've tried and tried again, and I'm sure that will happen again if he doesn't expire in prison, just based on his health conditions, which, he has other issues as well. The other couple people I mentioned, Robin Rowe, she was convicted of burning a house down where her family was, her family's home, and her husband and 2 children died in the blaze. She was also suspected actually of killing her other 2 younger children in other states, although was never charged or convicted with those. So she's probably high up on the list as well. There's been a recent ruling, and it was related to a U.S. Supreme Court ruling last year, as her counsel tried to argue that she had received ineffective counsel during her state case and sentencing because she has documented brain damage that wasn't introduced during sentencing. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled last year that is not a means for bringing a federal appeal, because the issue was not first raised at the state level. So that was tossed, although now on appeal in the 9th District Court in San Francisco, Circuit Court, excuse me. And then the next individual who probably would be eligible is the longest serving member of Idaho death row, and his name is Thomas Creech. He has been convicted of killing 4 people, had actually was found not guilty in a prior murder trial in Arizona in the 70s. It was an interesting case where he was convicted of killing 2 people in Valley County. And then that case was, the death sentence was actually tossed over an unconstitutionality issue. He later was convicted of murdering. Actually, I think he pleaded guilty, in fact, of murdering a fellow inmate, which then restored his death sentence. So he is probably one of the next who would be eligible for a death warrant once he exhausts his appeals. But that's kind of the lay of the land of the most likely of the next group of people. Currently, there's a stay in place at the federal level from Judge Windmill regarding the Pizzuto case. And so that could be some months out before he rules, and there's still additional appeals at play.
One thing that folks might find surprising, as you mentioned, that Idaho doesn't and historically hasn't had a lot of people on death row, partly just because it's a small state. But Idaho has actually pulled 2 wrongfully convicted people off of death row.
Yeah, and I mean, you're sort of the expert on that, probably more than I, but Charles Fain was said to be just a handful of days away from his execution. I believe the death warrant had been issued, and they were, prepping for his lethal injection. You'd probably have to check me on the year on that, but Senator Doug Ricks, actually the bill co-sponsor on the firing squad bill, was actually the man who sponsored that bill. It passed unanimously in the state Senate. And it financially compensates inmates who have been, proven wrongfully convicted. Chris Tapp was the other individual, although I don't believe he was on death row. Is that right?
Yeah, no, he wasn't on. Sorry, the other individual, I'm spacing his name right now for some reason, but he was convicted up in North Idaho of a murder, and it turned out later that he had only actually helped move a body, and so his sentence was reduced, and he was to time served, so he was ultimately released.
Got it.
But that is something that is probably worth thinking about. I think that given the small size of Idaho's death row, we've had to pull 2 people off it who were on it wrongly.
Yeah, and it raises all sorts of questions about the death penalty. And it is interesting that Doug Ricks is the one who's sponsoring the firing squad bill, because he knows very, very well firsthand that people have been wrongly convicted of murder, of first-degree murder. And yeah, I think the optics of one of our viewers is asking about the optics of particularly this type of capital punishment of the firing squad. And Gerald Pizzuto, we should mention that he has a history of he's been himself sexually abused and tortured as a child, and is developmentally disabled, and has all sorts of issues in addition to his medical problems. And so the optics might not look good. And again, I think the firing squad bill has brought to the forefront the issue of the death penalty and whether this is something that the state should be doing. So it is an interesting debate. We're just out of time, and I know we could probably go another hour and talk about more of these issues. But I want to thank Kevin for joining us. I want to thank everybody for joining us this week. We will be back next week at this same time with another episode of the Idaho Way. In the meantime, please sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, The Idaho Way. The link is below in the comments. And again, thank you to Kevin Fixler for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And we will see you again next week.